The click of the front door lock echoed louder than a gunshot in the rain-soaked night. For Lila, standing on the porch with nothing but the clothes on her back and the life growing inside her, that sound wasn't just a door closing. It was the sound of her world shattering, of every promise turning to dust. Her husband, the man who had vowed to cherish her, had just thrown her out like garbage, his voice dripping with a venom she'd never known. He thought he had won. He thought he had secured his future. What he didn't know was that Lila's past, a past he had so carelessly dismissed, was about to arrive with an army of lawyers and a truth that would bring his emir of lies crashing down around him. The house was Brent's masterpiece. Perched on a manicured hill overlooking the city, the sprawling modern home was all clean lines, glass walls, and cold-polished concrete. It was less a home and more a statement, a monument to his ambition. Brent Patterson loved statements. He loved his imported Italian suits, his Swiss watch that cost more than a modest car, and his wife Lila, who he often thought of as his most beautiful acquisition. Lila moved through the cavernous rooms like a ghost. She had tried to warm the place, adding soft throws to the minimalist leather sofas and placing family photos on the sterile floating shelves. But Brent would always move them, tidying her warmth away. "It clutters the aesthetic, darling," he'd say, not unkindly, but with a finality that permitted no argument. Their life, to any outside observer, was perfect. Brent was a rising star in real estate development, turning forgotten city lots into luxury condos. Lila was the gentle, graceful wife, the perfect hostess for his business dinners, her quiet smile a perfect accessory to his booming charisma. But lately the silence in the house had grown heavy. Brent was working later. His phone was always face down on the nightstand, and his touch, when it came at all, was fleeting and distracted. The change had sharpened when Lila told him she was pregnant. She had expected joy, perhaps even a crack in his meticulously composed facade. Instead, he had stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "A baby," he'd said the words flat. "Well, that's an expense." The comment had stung more than she let on. Her father, Robert Conway, was a man of quiet but considerable means. He had been a banker his entire life, a shrewd but fair man who had built a small regional bank into a significant financial institution through decades of patient, clever work. He had never been flashy. He drove a 10-year-old sedan and lived in the same comfortable but unpretentious suburban home Lila had grown up in. When they married, Robert had gifted them the down payment for their house, a sum so generous it had left Brent speechless. For Brent, who worshipped at the altar of wealth, Robert's quiet humility was a source of constant irritation. He saw it as a weakness, a failure to properly display his success. Your father could own half the city if he wanted. Brent would often complain after a family dinner, but he's content to sit on his gold like a dragon. No vision. Lila would defend him. He's happy, Brent. He doesn't need to prove anything. Success is about proving things, Lila. It's the only thing that matters. Now, 4 months into her pregnancy, the distance between them had become a chasm. Brent's comments about the expense of a child had become a recurring theme. He'd sigh dramatically over the cost of a crib, complain about the future hospital bills, and scrutinize every purchase she made. It was bizarre, given the lavish lifestyle he insisted upon for himself. One evening, as she was looking at a catalogue for nursery furniture, he'd snatched it from her hands. "We need to be practical," he'd snapped. We have the mortgage, the car payments. We can't afford to be frivolous." Frivolous? She'd asked, her voice trembling slightly. "This is for our child Brent. And what about that new watch you just bought?" He waved a dismissive hand. "That was an investment. It's about maintaining an image. You don't understand business." The condescension was a constant grating presence. He treated her like a child, a beautiful but simple-minded doll he kept in his glass house. The man she had fallen in love with, the charming, ambitious go-getter who had made her feel like the center of the universe, had vanished, replaced by this cold, calculating stranger. Her heart ached with a confusion she couldn't articulate. She told herself it was the stress of his work, the pressure of a new baby. She made excuses because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. The truth, however, was far uglier than she could have ever imagined, and it was about to come knocking. Or rather, it was about to be revealed in the sharp, artificial scent of a perfume that wasn't hers. It happened on a Tuesday. The air was thick with the promise of a storm, the sky a bruised purple. Brent had come home late, smelling of expensive whiskey and a cloying floral perfume. Lila, who had been fighting a wave of morning sickness that had decided to strike in the evening, was curled on the couch. She smelled it the moment he leaned in to give her a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. It wasn't her perfume. Hers was a subtle citrus scent. This was heavy, musky, and aggressive. It clung to the lapel of his suit jacket. "You're late," she said, her voice small. "Big deal went through." "Had to celebrate with the team," he said, already pulling off his tie and heading towards the bar. He didn't look at her. He never seemed to look at her anymore. Not really. He looked at her stomach with a faint look of annoyance, but his eyes slid past hers as if she were part of the furniture. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through her nausea. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a certainty, solidifying in her gut. She stood up, her hand instinctively going to her small, burgeoning belly. "What's her name, Brent?" He froze, his back to her, a crystal tumbler in his hand. "What are you talking about?" "The perfume. The late nights. The phone calls you walk out of the room to take." "I'm not stupid. What's her name?" He turned slowly, and for the first time in months, he looked directly at her. But there was no love in his eyes. There was only ice. "Don't be hysterical, Lila. It's not a good look on you, especially not now." He gestured vaguely at her stomach. "Tell me she insisted," her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Fine. You want to know her name is Naomi. And yes, we've been seeing each other. For a while, actually." The words hit her with a physical force. She staggered back, grabbing the arm of the sofa for support. The room seemed to tilt, the sharp angles of their designer furniture blurring at the edges. "But we're married. I'm pregnant with your child." "An inconvenient development, I'll admit," he said, taking a sip of his whiskey. His calmness was the most brutal part. He spoke of their life, their marriage, their unborn child, as if they were minor line items in a business ledger. "Look, Lila, I'm going to be honest with you. This whole thing, it's not working for me anymore. This whole thing." "You mean our marriage?" she whispered, disbelief warring with a tidal wave of pain. "I married you for your potential, Lila. I thought your father's connections, his money, would be an asset. But he's a relic. He doesn't understand how the modern world works. He handed me a check for the down payment, and that was it. No introductions, no opening doors. Just that." He sneered. Naomi, her family. They're different. They're players. They understand ambition. They're the future. Each word was a calculated strike designed to wound. He was telling her she was nothing more than a failed investment. Her family, the people she loved, were obsolete. "So you used me," she said, the realization dawning with horrific clarity. "You married me, hoping my father would fund your entire life. I had hoped he would be a more active investor." "Yes," Brent said smoothly. "But that's beside the point now. Naomi and I are going to build something real. And frankly, this house, this life, it's not big enough for 3 of us, and I certainly have no intention of it being big enough for 4. The cruelty of his last statement finally broke her. Sobs racked her body. "So what are you saying? You're just leaving?" "Not exactly," he said, setting his glass down with a soft click. He walked towards the front door. "You're leaving?" Lila stared at him, her mind unable to process the words. "What? No. This is my home, too. I'm carrying your baby. You can't just throw me out. Watch me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. He was surprisingly strong. He pulled her towards the foyer, his polished shoes silent on the marble floor. "This house is in my name, Lila. The mortgage is in my name. Everything that matters is in my name. You came into this with nothing but your father's check, and you'll leave with the same." "Brent." "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't do this. Think about the baby." "I am," he said, his face a mask of stone as he opened the front door. The wind and rain lashed at them. "I'm thinking this is the cleanest break. Now get out." He didn't just usher her out, he shoved her. She stumbled onto the wet stone of the porch, catching herself just before she fell. He threw her purse out after her. It landed in a puddle with a splash. Then, before she could even turn around, he closed the door. The heavy custom-made oak door swung shut, and with a final definitive click, the deadbolt slid into place. It was the sound of her world ending. The rain was cold, instantly soaking through her thin silk blouse. Lila stood on the porch, trembling not just from the chill, but from the profound shock that had paralyzed her entire body. The warm yellow light from inside the house. Her house seemed to mock her, illuminating the life she no longer had access to. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of the last 10 minutes. The confession, the cold, businesslike dismissal, the shove. It was a nightmare. Her purse lay in the puddle. With numb fingers she retrieved it, the leather already waterlogged. Her phone was inside. Her hands shook so badly she could barely unlock it. Who could she call? Her friends would be horrified, but what could they do? She had one person, the one person who had always been her rock, her safe harbor, her father. She scrolled to his name, Dad, and pressed the call button. It rang once, twice. She almost hung up, ashamed and humiliated, not wanting to burden him with her catastrophic failure of a marriage. Lila Bean. His voice, warm and familiar, was almost her undoing. A fresh wave of sobs escaped her. "Dad," she choked out. "Lila. What's wrong? Where are you? It sounds like you're outside." The concern in his voice was immediate and absolute. Brent, he threw me out," she managed to say between gasps. "He told me he's been cheating on me, and he He pushed me out of the house. He locked the door. There was a silence on the other end of the line, but it wasn't a passive silence. It was dense, heavy, like the pressure before a lightning strike. She could picture him perfectly sitting in his old leather armchair, his brow furrowed, his calm demeanor hardening into something else entirely. "Where are you right now, honey?" His voice was dangerously calm. All the warmth was gone, replaced by a focused, steely edge. "I'm on the porch. It's raining. Stay right there. Don't move. I'm going to make 2 calls and then I'm coming to get you. It will take me about 45 minutes. Can you find a dry spot under the eaves and wait for me?" "Okay," she whispered. "Lila, listen to me. Did he hurt you? Did he put his hands on you in any way other than pushing you out the door?" "He grabbed my arm," she said, her voice barely audible. Another pause. Longer this time. "I see Robert Conway," said, and the 2 words carried more menace than 1,000 shouted threats. "I'll be there soon. I love you." He hung up. Lila huddled under the small overhang of the porch roof, wrapping her arms around herself. The baby. Her mind raced with fear. The stress, the cold. She pressed a hand against her abdomen, trying to shield the tiny life from the ugliness of the world. Brent's words echoed in her head. A failed investment. An inconvenient development. He hadn't just betrayed her. He had negated her very existence and that of their child. 45 minutes felt like an eternity. Each passing car on the distant road made her jump. She imagined Brent inside, warm and dry, probably already on the phone with Naomi, laughing about how easy it had been to dispose of his pregnant wife. The thought fueled a new emotion alongside the pain and fear, a slow burning anger. How could she have been so blind? The signs had all been there. His obsession with status, his disdain for her family's quiet life, his transactional view of relationships. She had mistaken his ambition for passion, his materialism for a desire to provide. She had built a fantasy around a man who was hollow at his core. Finally, the familiar headlights of her father's old sedan cut through the rain. The car pulled into the sweeping driveway, looking utterly out of place next to Brent's sleek German sports car. Her father got out a large coat and an umbrella in his hands. He didn't say a word. He just walked up the steps, wrapped the warm, dry coat around her shivering shoulders, and held the umbrella over her head. He looked at the locked door, his expression grim. Then he looked at the bruise already forming on her arm, where Brent had grabbed her. His jaw tightened. "Let's go home," he said softly, leading her to his car. As she settled into the passenger seat, the familiar scent of old books and peppermints, a balm to her shattered nerves, she looked back at the glass house on the hill. It looked like a prison now, a beautiful empty cage. She didn't know what her father had planned, what those 2 phone calls had been about. She only knew that the storm that had broken over her life was far from over. The drive back to her childhood home was mostly silent. Robert let his daughter cry, offering a comforting hand on her shoulder but not pressing her with questions. He knew Lila needed to process the shock, and he needed time to let his own cold, calculated rage settle into a workable plan. When they arrived, her mother Helen was waiting, her face etched with worry. She enveloped Lila in a hug that smelled of cinnamon and safety, clucking over her wet clothes and ushering her upstairs to a warm bath and a comfortable bed. Downstairs, Robert sat in his study. The room was his sanctuary, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled not with fiction, but with volumes on economic theory, corporate law, and financial history. He wasn't a flashy man, but he was a deeply intelligent one. He understood that true power wasn't in loud declarations. It was in the fine print. It was in the structure of debt, the ownership of assets, and the unbreakable chains of liability. Brent Patterson had made one fatal mistake. He had looked at Robert Conway and seen a simple, small-town banker. He had failed to do his due diligence. He had no idea that Robert's regional bank, Conway Trust and Financial, had, over the last decade, quietly and strategically acquired smaller debt-holding firms, commercial loan portfolios, and venture capital branches. Robert didn't own a building with his name in flashing lights, but he owned the paper on hundreds of them. His influence was a vast, invisible web, and Brent had just flown right into the middle of it. His first call had been to his head of legal counsel, a sharp, merciless woman named Miss Chen. His second had been to the president of his commercial loans division, a man named Mr. Davies. Now he sat at his large mahogany desk and opened his laptop. He typed in Patterson Development LLC. The screen filled with data. Robert's eyes scanned the numbers, his expression unchanging. He saw the business loans Brent had taken out to fund his last 2 condo projects loans from a large national bank. He clicked a few more times, tracing the ownership of that debt. As he suspected, the portfolio containing those loans had been part of an acquisition by one of his subsidiary firms 6 months ago. Brent was borrowing his father-in-law's money and had no idea. Next, he looked up the mortgage on the house. It was also with a major lender. Another few clicks. Conway Trust had bought that lender's regional mortgage division last year. Brent was paying his mortgage to his father-in-law. Finally, he accessed Brent's personal credit lines, the ones tied to his business account for his platinum cards, the ones he used for his fancy suits and dinners with Naomi. The underlying creditor was again a company that ultimately reported to the board of Conway Trust and Financial. Robert leaned back in his chair. Brent had built his entire life, his entire illusion of success, using Robert's money. He had taken the generous gift of a down payment and used it as leverage to indebt himself to the very man he dismissed as a relic. It was an irony so perfect, so complete, that Robert almost smiled. Almost. The image of the bruise on his daughter's arm stopped him. This would not be a loud, angry confrontation. That was not his style. This would be a quiet, methodical, and complete dismantling. Brent had treated his daughter like a balance sheet. Robert would now show him what a real accounting looked like. He spent the next 2 days in his study. Lila rested comforted by her mother speaking in hushed tones about the betrayal. She was terrified about the future, about being a single mother, about having nothing. "Don't you worry about a thing," Lila Bean Robert told her firmly during a quiet moment in the kitchen. "You and this baby are all that matters. You just focus on being healthy. Let me worry about the details." On the 3rd day, a Friday morning, Robert put on his best, most unassuming grey suit. Ms. Chen and Mr. Davies met him in the driveway. They were the opposite of unassuming. Ms. Chen was impeccably dressed in a razor-sharp navy suit, her leather briefcase gleaming. Mr. Davies was a tall, imposing man whose sober, dark suit seemed to radiate authority. They didn't look like they were visiting family. They looked like they were executing a foreclosure, which in a way they were. "Is everything in order?" Robert asked them as he got into the back of Miss Chen's town car. Miss Chen handed him a thick folder. Every loan, every credit line, every asset. "He's leveraged to the hilt, Robert. The default clauses are ironclad. We have grounds to call in the entirety of his debt based on projected business instability and material misrepresentation on his initial loan applications. Misrepresentation? Robert asked, raising an eyebrow. He listed his marital connection to you as a potential future asset, implying a financial backing from your family that was never formally guaranteed. Mr. Davies supplied from the front seat. He used your good name to secure our money. Robert nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction settling in. Good. Let's go pay my son-in-law a visit. For Brent, the 3 days since he'd thrown Lila out had been a heady mix of liberation and triumph. The silence in the minimalist house was no longer heavy. It was clean. It was the sound of potential of a future unburdened by a clingy wife and the expense of a child he never wanted. He had called Naomi the moment Lila's taxi had disappeared down the street. It's done, he'd said, a smirk in his voice. The house is ours. Naomi had squealed with delight. She had come over that night, her expensive perfume finally able to permeate the space without competition. They had toasted with champagne, standing in front of the massive glass wall that overlooked the city lights. To us, Naomi had said, clinking her glass against his. To the new power couple. To a future without baggage, Brent had replied, his arm around her waist. They spent the next 2 days acting as if they were already masters of the manor. Naomi talked excitedly about redecorating, about turning the room Lila had planned as a nursery into a home gym and yoga studio. No need for all that soft, sentimental clutter, she'd declared, wrinkling her nose at the pastel paint swatches Lila had left on a counter. Brent had never felt more powerful. He had, in his mind, executed a perfect corporate merger. He had divested from a failing asset, Lila and her stagnant family, and acquired a new promising one, Naomi and her well-connected aggressive family. He'd even had a preliminary lunch with Naomi's father, a cutthroat developer who saw Brent as a kindred spirit. The future was bright, shiny, and expensive. He spent Friday morning on the phone with his contractors, barking orders about his new condo project, feeling the familiar thrill of command. He was the king of his castle, the master of his universe. When the doorbell chimed around 11 o'clock, he was annoyed. He wasn't expecting anyone. He glanced at the security camera feed on his phone. A black town car was in his driveway. Standing on his porch were 3 figures. One was Robert Conway, looking as dull and unimpressive as ever in his cheap-looking grey suit. The other 2, however, were different. A man and a woman, both dressed in severe, expensive business attire, holding sleek leather briefcases. They looked like lawyers. Brent's first thought was that Robert had come to plead on Lila's behalf, maybe to offer him some money to take her back. A smirk touched his lips. He would enjoy turning him down. He strode to the door and pulled it open with a flourish. "Robert," he said, his tone dripping with false cordiality. "To what do I owe the pleasure? And you've brought associates." "Brent Robert," said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "This is Ms. Chen, my chief counsel, and this is Mr. Davies from my commercial assets division. May we come in? We have some business to discuss." The mention of commercial assets gave Brent a momentary pause, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. They were here to talk about a settlement, a divorce. This was just Robert trying to look intimidating. "Of course," Brent said, stepping aside. "Come on in. Can I get you anything coffee water? We won't be staying long." Ms. Chen said, her voice as sharp and cold as the angles of the house. They didn't sit on the offered sofa. They stood in the center of the vast living room, a phalanx of grim-faced professionals. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The feeling of triumph that Brent had been savoring began to curdle into a vague sense of unease. So Brent began trying to take control of the situation. I assume this is about Lila. Look, I'm sorry it had to end this way, but these things happen. I'm prepared to be very reasonable about the divorce settlement. Robert looked at him, a flicker of something that might have been pity in his eyes. We're not here to discuss the divorce, Brent. That's a personal matter for Lila to handle. We're here to discuss a professional one. We're here to discuss your debt. Brent laughed. It was not a sound of mirth, but a sharp, percussive burst of disbelief and condescension. He actually leaned back on his heels, a smirk playing on his lips as he folded his arms across his chest. The initial flicker of unease had been extinguished by his own ingrained arrogance. This was exactly what he expected. A pathetic, emotional appeal from a man out of his depth, flanked by a couple of small-time lawyers he'd probably hired for the occasion to try and look intimidating. My debt, he repeated, savoring the word as if it were a fine wine. What on earth does my debt have to do with you, Robert? Let me guess. You're here to offer to pay it all off for me in exchange for taking Lila back. Is that it? A grand gesture from the concerned father. I appreciate the thought. I really do. But I have to tell you, the price for that kind of reconciliation would be very, very high. Probably more than you'd be willing to part with. He was enjoying this, the feeling of absolute power. He was the one in control here, and this little delegation was just a sad confirmation of his victory. Robert did not react. His face remained a placid, unreadable mask. The response came instead from Mr. Davies, who stepped forward with the unhurried confidence of a man who held all the cards. He opened his briefcase on Brent's glass coffee table, the very table where Brent and Naomi had toasted their new life, and laid out a single, thick, professionally bound document. The thud of the paper on the glass was a small, definitive sound in the cavernous room. Mr. Patterson, we are not here to negotiate a family matter. Mr. Davies began, his voice a steady, implacable drone that seemed to absorb the room's ambient light. We are here to inform you of a change in your financial status. This is a summary of your current liabilities. For the sake of clarity, let's start with your primary business concern, Patterson Development, LLC. He tapped a manicured finger on the top page. You currently have 2 outstanding commercial loans for your Azure Point and Skyview Terrace projects. The combined principal totals approximately $42 million. The original lender, as you know, was First National Commercial Bank. I'm well aware of my own business loans. Thank you, Brent, said his voice laced with impatience. This was tedious. My payments are all current. My accounts are in perfect standing. What is the point of this? Mr. Davies didn't even look up. He continued as if Brent hadn't spoken. First National Commercial's loan portfolio was acquired 9 months ago by the CFG Investment Group. You would have received a standard notice of the transfer of servicer. Brent vaguely remembered a memo from his accounting department, something he had glanced at and dismissed as routine corporate shuffling. And CFG Investment Group, Mr. Davies said, finally lifting his eyes to meet Brent's, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Conway Trust and Financial. You've been paying your father-in-law's bank for nearly a year, Mr. Patterson. Congratulations. The air in Brent's lungs seemed to turn to ice. The smug, confident smirk on his face faltered, twitching at the corners. He stared at Mr. Davies, then shot a wild, disbelieving look at Robert. That's impossible. That can't be right. Conway Trust is a small regional player. They don't operate at that level. His own words sounded hollow, a desperate attempt to reaffirm a reality that was rapidly dissolving around him. A common misconception, Ms. Chen interjected, her voice as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. She produced another document from her own briefcase, laying it neatly beside the first. The trap was being set piece by methodical piece. Now let's discuss this house, a beautiful property. Your statement piece. You have a mortgage of $3.2 million with Metro Urban Lenders. A fine institution. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, began to crawl up Brent's throat. He knew what was coming before she even said it. He felt a profound sense of vertigo, as if the polished concrete floor was tilting beneath his feet, sliding him toward an open abyss. As you may have read in the financial news last year, she continued, her tone dripping with mock helpfulness. Conway Trust acquired Metro Urban's entire regional mortgage division in a strategic expansion. Your last 7 mortgage payments, including the one that cleared just last week, have been processed through our central office. This house, Mr. Patterson, belongs to us. Brent stumbled back a step, his bravado not just vanishing but being ripped out of him, leaving a gaping wound of pure horror. The walls of his home, the very symbol of his success and his new life with Naomi, suddenly felt like the bars of a cage he had unknowingly built for himself. He was a fool, a preening, arrogant fool played from the very beginning. And finally Miss Chen said, delivering the coup de grace, there are the small things. The lifestyle, your personal and business credit lines, the platinum cards you use for travel, for those expensive dinners at Venti, for the suits and the watches, all issued by institutions whose debt portfolios are underwritten and ultimately held by Conway Trust. In total, Brent, your entire financial existence, your business, your home, the very clothes on your back is leveraged with funds that he... She gestured with her pen towards Robert. Ultimately controls. For the first time since he had entered the room, Robert spoke again. He took a slow step away from the window, his quiet presence suddenly more immense and terrifying than any shouting threat. You called me a relic, Brent. You told my daughter I didn't understand how the modern world works. But you see, I do. I understand that true power isn't in the shiny things you can buy. It's in owning the paper that allows other people to buy shiny things. You built a house of cards on what you thought was a solid foundation, but the foundation was me all along. You thought you were the architect, but you were just a tenant borrowing my bricks, and I'm cashing out. The words hung in the air, each one a death sentence. Brent stared at him, his mouth agape, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of panic and denial. The web was complete. Every direction he turned, he was trapped. Every dollar he thought he had earned. Every deal he thought he had closed, every brick he thought he had laid was built upon a foundation owned by the man he had sauntered on and discarded. He had not just married Lila. He had, in effect, signed the most binding and foolish business contract of his life without ever reading the fine print. And he had just tried to dissolve the partnership by throwing the chairman's daughter out into the rain. What? What does that mean? Brent stammered the question, a pathetic squeak from a man who once roared. Miss Davies answered his tone as devoid of emotion as a legal filing. It means we are calling in your loans. All of them. Effective immediately. You can't do that, Brent finally shrieked, his voice cracking with a raw, primal panic. You can't. My payments are current. There's no legal reason. On the contrary, Ms. Chen said coolly, tapping a specific clause on one of the documents before her. Her finger rested on the text like an executioner's blade. We have several perfectly legal reasons. Your initial applications contained what we have now identified as material misrepresentations regarding implied familial financial backing. You used your marriage to Mr. Conway's daughter as a selling point to secure our money, which constitutes a form of fraud. Furthermore, your recent, shall we say, lifestyle changes present a significant reputational risk and project a brand instability that we, as the primary creditor, are no longer comfortable with. The default clauses in your loan agreements are quite clear. We have the right to demand full and immediate repayment if we believe our investment is at risk. And Mr. Conway, she glanced at Robert, believes his investment is very much at risk. The silence that descended upon the room was heavier and more suffocating than any sound. It was the silence of a tomb, the dead air after a fatal blow. For Brent, it was absolute. The confident, articulate man who had commanded boardrooms and charmed investors was gone, replaced by a hollow shell whose mind was frantically trying to outrun an avalanche. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine, blocking out everything but the echo of Ms. Chen's final devastating pronouncements. He looked from her cold, impassive face to the stoic figure of Mr. Davies. Then finally his desperate gaze landed on Robert. His father-in-law had not moved. He stood by the expansive glass wall, his hands clasped behind his back, looking not at the ruin of the man before him, but out at the glittering city skyline, the very view that Brent had believed was the ultimate symbol of his triumph, his conquest. It was his. He had paid millions for it. But the view now seemed to mock him, a panorama of a world he was no longer a part of. The entire structure of his reality had been revealed as a lie. He was not a king in his castle. He was a tenant in his father-in-law's property. He was not a brilliant developer. He was a debtor, unknowingly making payments to the very man he had dismissed as an irrelevant old fossil. The floor, so solid and polished beneath his feet, suddenly felt like a sheet of thin ice cracking and groaning under the impossible weight of his ignorance. "Robert, please." Brent finally managed to whisper the name, tasting like ash and bile in his dry mouth. His arrogance, the very fuel that had powered his existence, had evaporated in an instant, leaving behind only the raw, sputtering engine of pure terror. He took a staggering step forward, his hands slightly raised in a gesture of supplication. "Please, it was a mistake, a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. I was angry. I was stressed about the new projects. I didn't mean it. I'll fix things with Lila. I'll get on my knees. I'll do anything. We can reverse this." Robert turned his head slowly, his movement deliberate and devoid of haste. His eyes, calm and clear, finally met Brent's. There was no rage in them, no fire of retribution. There was no hatred. There was only a profound, bottomless disappointment and a chilling finality that was far more terrifying than any anger could ever be. "You don't seem to understand, Brent." Robert said, his voice quiet, but carrying an immense gravity that filled the cavernous room. "This is not a negotiation. There is nothing to fix. There is no reversing this. You have a fundamental misunderstanding of your situation, just as you have had a fundamental misunderstanding of me from the very beginning. You believe you made a mistake. You didn't. You made a series of business decisions." He paused, letting the words sink in, twisting the knife of Brent's own transactional worldview. Your first decision was to leverage yourself to the absolute limit, building an image of success on a mountain of debt. Your second was to build your entire enterprise on my money, all while holding me and my family in private contempt. And your third, your most critical and unforgivable business decision, was made 3 nights ago when you laid your hands on my pregnant daughter and threw her out of her home into a storm. Robert took a single measured step forward, away from the window. You see this house? He asked, his voice still unnervingly calm. You walk through it with the pride of an owner. But you are not the owner. You are merely the occupant of an asset whose deed is held as collateral against a loan you can no longer pay. As of this moment, you are trespassing. Brent's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. He felt a crushing weight on his chest, as if the immense glass walls of his precious house were slowly closing in on him. Those condo developments you are so proud of. Robert continued, his voice relentless and methodical. Their funding will be frozen by the end of the business day. The contractors will receive a stop work order. Your investors will panic. Your new business partners, like Naomi's ambitious father, will scatter the second they hear that Conway Trust has pulled its funding. They will see you not as a peer, but as a liability. By Monday morning, Patterson Development LLC will be a hollowed-out shell facing a dozen lawsuits and an inevitable bankruptcy. Every word was a nail being hammered into the lid of his coffin. Brent's vision started to swim, the sharp, clean lines of the room blurring and warping at the edges. The cars are leased through a company we own. They will be repossessed tomorrow. Robert went on, ticking off the items of Brent's life, as if reading from an inventory sheet. The credit cards will be declined the next time you try to buy a cup of coffee. The bank accounts tied to your business and your person will be frozen to cover outstanding liabilities. You valued polish over people, Brent. You valued statements over substance. You have built a life based on an image, and I am simply and very quietly taking away the props that hold it up. Brent wanted to scream, to rage, to deny it all, but no sound would come out. He was paralyzed, caught in the invisible, unbreakable threads of the web he had never even seen. He thought of Naomi, her bright, hard laugh, her admiration for his power. Would she stand by him? He knew the answer with a sickening certainty. She was drawn to the sun, and he was now a black hole. You put a price on my daughter. Robert, said his voice, dropping now to barely a whisper, a tone so intimate it was more piercing than any shout. In your cold accounting, you saw her as an asset, a failed investment. So I am showing you what it feels like when your most valuable asset is liquidated. You are bankrupt, Brent. But your financial ruin is the least of your problems. It is merely a symptom of a much deeper poverty. You are morally bankrupt, spiritually bankrupt. You have nothing left because you were never anything to begin with. That was the final blow. The word nothing. It echoed in the vast, empty space where his future used to be. It was the valuation of his entire existence. The floor seemed to drop away from him completely. His knees, no longer able to support the weight of his shattered world, buckled. A strangled animal cry of pure despair tore from his throat as his vision narrowed to a black tunnel. The last thing he saw were the indistinct, swimming faces of Robert Miss Chen and Mr. Davies watching him without pity as he pitched forward. Brent Patterson. The man who thought he had it, all the master of his universe, collapsed in a heap onto the cold, polished concrete floor of the house that was never truly his. 6 months later, the world had turned. The bruised, storm-soaked sky of that terrible night had given way to a season of soft golden light. This light now streamed through the large bay window of a sun-drenched room illuminating the gentle dance of dust motes in the air. The room smelled of baby powder, warm milk, and fresh linen, the perfume of a new life. Lila sat in a sturdy wooden rocking chair, a family heirloom that had held 3 generations of mothers. Its gentle creak, a soothing rhythm against the polished hardwood floor. In her arms, nestled against her heart, slept her son, Leo. She had named him Leo because it meant lion, and she wanted him to possess a strength of heart his father could never comprehend. He was tiny perfect, his little chest rising and falling in the profound peace of infancy. His tiny starfish hand was curled tightly around her index finger, a small anchor in her new calm sea. As she looked down at his serene face, a wave of love so fierce and overwhelming washed over her that it still, after weeks of motherhood, took her breath away. This was real. This solid, warm weight in her arms, this unconditional bond. This was the wealth Brent had spoken of, though he had never truly understood the word. She glanced around the nursery. It was a world away from the cold, minimalist cage she had once called home. The walls were a cheerful butter yellow. A mobile of hand-stitched felt animals turned slowly above the crib. The bookshelves her father had built were overflowing, not with design magazines, but with colorful children's books and well-loved stuffed animals. Every object in the room was a testament to love, not a statement of status. Her mother had sewn the curtains. Her father had painted the walls. This room was a fortress built of affection, and inside it, Lila felt herself healing stitch by stitch. The divorce had been a quiet, sterile affair, a mere formality that passed in a blur of paperwork. Brent had been a ghost at the proceedings, his presence thin and brittle. He had not contested a single thing. He was in no position to. Lila had asked for nothing from him. No alimony, no child support, no bitter settlement. She wanted no ties, no financial chains that would keep her tethered to the memory of him. Her freedom was worth more than any check he could no longer write. She had her name back, Lila Conway, and in shedding the name Patterson, she felt as though she had shed a heavy, ill-fitting coat. She had heard about Brent's fate, not through any effort of her own, but through the inevitable whispers that travel through old social circles. A former acquaintance had called her voice laced with a hesitant, gossipy sort of pity. Just as her father had predicted, Brent's empire had not just crumbled. It had been pulverized, turning to dust overnight. His business partners, including Naomi's cutthroat father, had severed all ties the moment the news broke that Conway Trust had pulled his funding. His name was poison in the development community. And Naomi, the dazzling prize for whom he had sacrificed everything, had vanished. She had not lingered to witness the collapse. Her loyalty, it turned out, was an asset with a price tag, and a bankrupt boyfriend was a liability she couldn't afford. The last Lila heard. Brent was living in a grim one-bedroom apartment on the industrial side of town, the kind with thin walls and a view of a brick alleyway. He was working a commission-only job, selling discount office supplies over the phone. The caller had described seeing him on the street, his once impeccable Italian suit replaced by a cheap, wrinkled polyester one that hung awkwardly on his thinned frame. The arrogant, confident stride was gone, replaced by the weary, defeated shuffle of a man haunted by the ghosts of his own ambition. Lila felt no surge of triumph at this news, no satisfying sting of schadenfreude. There was only a profound, quiet sense of closure. He was a stranger to her now, the protagonist of a sad story she had once been a part of. He had chased an image of success so relentlessly that he had become hollow, and once the glamorous frame was stripped away, there was simply nothing left inside. He had lost everything, because he had never understood the value of anything that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. A soft footstep in the doorway brought her back to the present. Her father stood there, not wanting to disturb the peaceful scene. His face, which had been a mask of grim determination for weeks after her return home, was softer now, the lines around his eyes etched by smiles rather than stress. He looked at his daughter and then at his grandson, and a look of pure, unadulterated joy transformed him. He tiptoed into the room, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "How's my favorite little lion doing?" Lila smiled, a genuine, soul-deep smile that reached her eyes. "Sleeping soundly. Dreaming of hostile takeovers, I think." Her father chuckled, pulling up a small stool to sit beside her. He reached out a single calloused finger and gently stroked Leo's soft cheek. "He has your peaceful nature, Lila Bean." Thank goodness. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long moment, the only sounds the creak of the rocker and the baby's soft breathing. "Thank you, Dad," Lila whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for all of that, but for this, for never saying I told you so." He looked at her, his expression serious. There was nothing to say. A father protects his family. It's the only contract that matters. Brent's failure was his own doing. My only concern was and always will be you and him. He nodded toward the sleeping baby. In his simple words, Lila understood the vast difference between Brent and her father. Brent saw life as a series of transactions. Her father saw it as a sacred trust. He had never gloated about Brent's ruin. He had simply been there, a quiet, unshakable mountain, providing the shelter she needed to rebuild her world on a foundation of rock, not sand. She looked from her father's kind face to her son's innocent one. The memory of that night, the cold rain, the venom in Brent's voice, the final brutal click of the deadbolt, no longer felt like a scar. It felt like a turning point. That sound, which she once thought was her world shattering, was actually the sound of her cage breaking open. Brent had meant to throw her away, but instead he had set her free. Free from a life of cold surfaces and hollow promises, and free to discover a life of true, meaningful, and immeasurable substance. We've just witnessed the complete and total downfall of a man who believed that people were just assets to be managed and discarded. Brent thought he was making a smart business move by throwing his pregnant wife Lila out of his life. He saw her and her family as obstacles to his ambition, but he made a fatal miscalculation. He underestimated the quiet, patient power of a father's love and the unbreakable laws of karma. In his greedy pursuit of a flashier future, he ignored the foundation his entire life was built on. And when it was pulled out from under him, he was left with nothing. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't always loud and flashy. Sometimes it's the silent, steady force that moves mountains, and that treating people with cruelty and disrespect is a debt that always eventually gets called in. If this story of betrayal and righteous justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who appreciates a story where karma delivers the final satisfying verdict. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of life's dramatic twists and turns. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.